the autumn of 1396, the rolling hills of Bulgaria witnessed the death of an empire's dream. Here, beneath the shadow of the fortress of Nicopolis, the largest crusading army ever assembled would meet its doom in a clash that would echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. This was not merely another battle between Christian and Muslim forces. This was the moment when medieval chivalry met its match against the disciplined fury of Ottoman warfare, when the flower of European nobility withered under the crescent banner of Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt. The story begins not with the clash of steel, but with the creeping dread that had settled over Christian Europe like a shroud. For decades, the Ottoman tide had been rising, swallowing kingdom after kingdom, fortress after fortress. The great victory at Kosovo in 1389 had shattered Serbian resistance and opened the gates to the very heart of the Balkans. By 1396, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to little more than the walls of Constantinople itself, blockaded and strangling under Ottoman siege. In the gilded halls of Western Europe, kings and nobles watched with growing alarm as reports flooded in from the east, villages burned, churches desecrated, and Christian populations enslaved or scattered to the winds. The Ottoman war machine, led by the brilliant and ruthless Sultan Bayezid, seemed unstoppable in its advance toward the heart of Christendom. This was a man who had earned his fearsome nickname through campaigns that struck like lightning, conquering vast territories with a speed that left his enemies reeling. Pope Boniface IX understood the gravity of the moment. In 1394, he issued a call that would reverberate across every court and cathedral in Europe. This was to be no ordinary military expedition, but a holy crusade to halt the Ottoman advance and save Christian civilization itself. The papal bull proclaimed that all who took the cross would receive full absolution for their sins, transforming what might have been a political war into a sacred mission blessed by God himself. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the courts of France came the cream of chivalry, men whose names were legend and whose prowess in battle was unquestioned. Philip of Artois, Count of Eu and Constable of France, declare in the crusade Todd participation be the duty of every man of valor. Beside him stood Jean Le Mange, Marshal of France, a warrior whose reputation had been forged in countless battles across the continent. But perhaps no figure captured the spirit of the crusade more than John of Burgundy, Count of Nevers, a young nobleman whose courage would earn him the epithet fearless. At barely 30 years of age, he commanded the respect of hardened veterans and the loyalty of thousands of knights who would follow him to the gates of hell itself. His banner became a rallying point for the flower of French chivalry, men who saw in this crusade not merely duty, but destiny. The gathering army was of this spectacle unlike anything Europe had witnessed in generations. From Burgundy and France came knights in gleaming mail, their surcoats blazoned with the arms of noble houses stretching back centuries. German princes brought disciplined contingents of heavy cavalry, while English volunteers crossed the Channel to join what saw many as the last great adventure of the age of chivalry. Yet it was in Hungary that this Western army would find its true strength. King Sigismund of Luxembourg, ruler of Hungary and later Holy Roman Emperor, brought with him 70,000 men. His kingdom stood as the last great barrier between Ottoman expansion and the heart of Europe, and he understood better than most what defeat would mean. Hungarian cavalry, hardened by decades of border warfare, joined forces with Polish knights, Croatian warriors, and contingents from across the frag Europe. The combined landscape of medieval assembled force that in the spring of 1396 numbered perhaps 100,000 fighting men. It was an army that dwarfed anything seen since the great crusades of centuries past. Knights from every corner of Christendom had answered the call, bringing with them the accumulated wealth and martial tradition of 1,000 years. Their banners fluttered in the wind like a forest of silk and gold, each one representing a lineage, a legacy, and a sacred vow to drive back the Ottoman tide. But beneath the glittering surface of this magnificent host lay fundamental weaknesses that would prove fatal when tested in battle. The very diversity that made the army so impressive also made it nearly impossible to command effectively. French nobles refused to acknowledge Hungarian authority, while German princes insisted on their ancient rights of precedence. The concept of unified command, so crucial to military success, remained foreign to men raised in the traditions of feudal independence and personal honor. The French contingent, in particular, remained wedded to concepts of chivalry that belonged to an earlier age. Rules of discipline decreed at the War Council included the provision that the Count of Nevers and his company would claim the vanguard in any battle, regardless of tactical considerations. This was not strategy but ceremony, a ritual observance of knightly honor that would place personal glory above military necessity. As this massive army began its long march toward the Danube, Sultan Bayezid was far from idle. Known throughout the Islamic world as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, he had earned his reputation through a series of campaigns that combined tactical brilliance with ruthless efficiency. Unlike his European opponents, who saw warfare as an extension of personal honor, Bayezid understood battle as a science to be mastered and an art to be perfected. The Sultan's army was smaller than the crusading host, perhaps 70,000 men, but it possessed advantages that numbers alone could not provide. These were professional soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns across 3 continents. The famous Janissaries, elite infantry recruited from Christian children and raised as Muslim warriors, formed the disciplined core of Ottoman infantry. Sipahi cavalry, the equivalent of European knights, but trained in flexible tactics rather than rigid charges, provided mobile striking power that could adapt to any battlefield situation. More importantly, Bayezid's forces operated under a unified command structure that allowed for rapid response to changing conditions. Where the Crusaders would debate and argue over precedence, the Ottomans would act with the precision of a single mind directing multiple limbs. This difference in military culture would prove decisive when the 2 armies finally met in battle. The strategic situation that drew both armies to Nicopolis was itself a microcosm of the broader struggle between Christianity and Islam in southeastern Europe. The fortress of Nicopolis, perched above the Danube in what is now Bulgaria, had fallen to Ottoman forces in 1393. Its capture had completed the conquest of the Second Bulgarian Empire and positioned Ottoman forces for further advances into Hungarian territory. For the Crusaders, Nicopolis represented both opportunity and necessity. Recapturing the fortress would not only restore a key strongpoint to Christian control, but would also demonstrate that Ottoman expansion could be reversed. The psychological impact of such a victory would resonate across Europe, inspiring further resistance and potentially triggering a broader Christian revival. As autumn approached and the 2 armies drew closer to their fateful encounter, neither side fully understood what they were about to unleash. The Crusaders, confident in their numbers and their cause, believed that divine providence would guide their swords to victory. The Ottomans, masters of a military system that had conquered half the known world, prepared to demonstrate once again that discipline and innovation could triumph over tradition and faith. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not merely the fate of a fortress, but the future of an entire civilization. The fortress of Nicopolis loomed against the September sky like a stone sentinel guarding the waters of the Danube. Its walls had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the prayers of Christian defenders, and now the green banners of Ottoman occupation. For 3 years it had stood as a symbol of Islamic triumph, its towers flying the crescent moon that marked the westernmost edge of Bayezid's expanding domain. But as the leaves began to turn golden in the Bulgarian hills, those same walls would become the stage for one of history's most consequential battles. The crusading army that arrived before Nicopolis in late September was a sight to behold. Banners snapped in the autumn wind, their colors brilliant against the gray stones of the fortress. The thunder of hooves and the clatter of mail echoed across the valley as column after column of knights took their positions. Pavilions sprouted like multicolored flowers across the landscape, each one marking the camp of a noble house or military order. Yet for all their magnificence, the Crusaders faced an immediate tactical problem. Nicopolis was no ordinary castle to be taken by storm. Its position above the Danube made it nearly impregnable to direct assault, while its Ottoman garrison was well supplied and determined to hold. The siege that followed would test not only the military skills of the Christian army, but the fragile unity that held their diverse coalition together. King Sigismund, whose experience in fighting the Ottomans exceeded that of any other Crusader leader, understood the true nature of their opponent. This was not the fragmented resistance they had faced in previous campaigns, but a unified empire with resources that could match or exceed their own. He urged caution, suggesting they establish a proper blockade and wait for hunger to do what swords might fail to accomplish. But patience was not a virtue that came naturally to the French nobility. Knights who had traveled hundreds of miles to win glory in battle chafed at the prospect of a prolonged siege. The very idea of waiting behind earthworks, while their enemy remained safely within stone walls, seemed to violate every principle of chivalric warfare. Honor demanded action, and action meant facing the foe in open battle where courage could decide the outcome. As the siege dragged on through the early days of autumn, tensions within the Crusader camp began to fester. French knights questioned Hungarian authority, while Hungarian commanders grew frustrated with their allies' refusal to accept tactical discipline. Supply lines stretched back across hundreds, a show of miles began, and the enthusiasm strain that had marked the army's departure slowly gave way to the grinding reality of medieval warfare. Meanwhile, Sultan Bayezid was moving with the speed that had earned him his legendary nickname. Ottoman intelligence networks, far more sophisticated than anything possessed by the Crusaders, had kept him informed of Christian movements from the moment they crossed into Ottoman territory. While the Crusaders debated strategy before Nicopolis, the Sultan was assembling his own forces with characteristic efficiency. The Ottoman army that marched to relieve Nicopolis represented the pinnacle of medieval Islamic military organization. At its core marched the Janissaries, their white felt caps and gleaming scimitars marking them as the elite of the Sultan's infantry. These were men who had been raised from childhood to serve the Ottoman state, their loyalty absolute and their training without equal in the known world. Behind them came the Sipahi cavalry, horsemen whose mobility and tactical flexibility had shattered armies from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Anatolia. But perhaps the most tragic element of Bayezid's force was the contingent of Serbian knights who rode under the banner of Stefan Lazarević. These Orthodox Christians, bound by feudal obligation to serve their Ottoman overlord, carried with them the bitter knowledge that they would soon face fellow Christians in battle. The irony was not lost on men who had once fought against Ottoman expansion, but now found themselves compelled to serve it. Stefan Lazarević himself embodied the complex loyalties that characterized Balkan politics in this era. Son of Prince Lazar, who had died fighting the Ottomans at Kosovo, he now served the very empire that had destroyed his father's kingdom. The weight of this contradiction was evident in the words attributed to him by chroniclers before the battle, when he supposedly prayed that God would help the Christians and that he might be among the first to die in the coming fight. As September waned, and the first hints of winter began to touch the Bulgarian hills, both armies prepared for the confrontation that would determine the fate of southeastern Europe. The Crusaders, despite their internal divisions, confident that remained divine providence and superior numbers would carry the day. Their camps echoed with the sound of sharpening steel and muttered prayers, while priests moved among the ranks, offering final absolution to men who sensed that death was riding toward them on the autumn wind. The Ottomans, by contrast, prepared with the methodical precision that characterized their military system. Scouts mapped every hill and valley around Nicopolis, while engineers calculated fields of fire and identified the best positions for their archers. Bayezid himself rode among his troops, his presence a reminder that victory would bring not only glory but tangible rewards from a sultan known for his generosity to warriors. The stage successful was set for a battle that would be remembered, not for the heroism of individual knights or the valor of particular units, but for the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare. On one side stood the flower of European chivalry, men raised in traditions that valued personal honor above tactical necessity and individual glory above collective victory. On the other waited the disciplined ranks of Ottoman professionals, soldiers who understood that war was won not by courage alone but by the coordinated application of superior strategy and technique. As the sun set on September 24th, both armies made their final preparations for the dawn that would bring either triumph or catastrophe. In the Crusader camps, knights spent long hours in prayer, commending their souls to God and their swords to the service of Christendom. Among the Ottoman ranks, Veteran soldiers checked their weapons and armor with the calm efficiency of men who had faced death 100 times before. The morning of September 25th, 1396, would dawn clear and cold over the hills of Nicopolis. By its end, the course of European history would be forever altered. The morning mist clung to the Danube like a funeral shroud as the armies stirred in their camps. Across the valley, the sound of armor being donned and weapons tested created a symphony of impending doom. In the Crusader pavilions, knights knelt before traveling altars, their heads bowed in final communion with their god. The air was thick with incense and whispered Latin prayers, while outside their tents, squires hurried to prepare the great war horses that would carry their masters into legend or into the grave. King Sigismund rose before dawn, his weathered face betraying the weight of command that pressed upon his shoulders. He understood, perhaps better than any man in the Christian camp, that this day would determine whether Hungary remained a bulwark against Ottoman expansion or became another province in Bayezid's growing empire. His had brought scouts disturbing news during the night. The Ottoman army was larger than expected, and worse still, it was positioned with the tactical cunning that marked all of the Sultan's campaigns. Yet when Sigismund called his war council, he found himself facing the same stubborn pride that had plagued the Crusade from its inception. The French nobles, resplendent in their heraldic surcoats, insisted that honor demanded they lead the charge. Count John of Nevers, his young face flushed with the excitement of impending battle, declared that French knights had not traveled so far to skulk behind Hungarian shields. The very suggestion that they might wait for infantry support or coordinate their attack with allied forces was treated as an insult to their ancient lineage. Philippe d'Artois, the grizzled constable of France, nodded his agreement. These were men whose grandfathers had charged at Crécy and whose fathers had fallen at Poitiers, yet they seemed incapable of learning from those disasters. The lessons of English longbows and disciplined infantry had been forgotten in the intoxicating dream of knightly glory. To them, battle was not a science to be studied, but a sacrament to be celebrated, a chance to prove their worth before God and man. Marshal Boucicaut, younger than most but already renowned for his prowess, spoke with the fervor of a man who saw this crusade as his path to immortality. The Ottomans, he declared, were infidels who would crumble before the righteous fury of Christian knights. Their strange tactics and foreign weapons meant nothing against men who fought with God's blessing and generations of noble blood flowing through their veins. His words were met with cheers from the assembled nobility, each knight eager to believe that courage alone could triumph over strategy. Sigismund watched this display with growing despair. He had faced Ottoman armies before and knew the deadly efficiency of their tactics. The Sultan's forces did not fight for individual glory but for collective victory, each unit moving in coordination with others like the fingers of a single hand. Their archers could darken the sky with arrows, their cavalry could strike from unexpected angles, and their infantry could hold ground against any charge. Most dangerous of all, they fought under a unified command that could adapt to changing circumstances in moments. As the sun climbed higher, the Ottoman army began to deploy across the field with mechanical precision. From his position on a nearby hill, Sultan Bayezid surveyed the approaching battle with the cold calculation of a master craftsman examining his tools. His forces had been positioned to take maximum advantage of the terrain, with concealed reserves ready to strike at the crucial moment. The Serbian cavalry under Stefan Lazarević had been positioned in the woods to the right, invisible to the Crusaders, but perfectly placed to deliver a devastating flank attack. The Sultan's battle plan was a masterpiece of deception and coordination. His front line consisted of conscripted infantry, men whose primary purpose was to absorb the initial Christian charge and tire the enemy horses. Behind them waited rows of sharpened stakes, cunningly concealed but ready to impale any mount that broke through the first defense. The real strength of the Ottoman army lay in its second and third lines, where veteran Janissaries and Sipahi cavalry waited with the patience of hunters watching their prey approach the trap. Bayezid himself had donned Hungarian clothing the night before, riding close to the walls of Nicopolis to speak with his garrison commanders. His presence had electrified the defenders, while his tactical instructions ensured that every element of his plan would unfold with deadly, was warfare precision. This, as the Ottomans understood it, not a clash of individual heroes, but a coordinated symphony of destruction conducted by a master strategist. The moment of decision arrived with the sound of trumpets echoing across the valley. Despite Sigismund's final desperate pleas for coordination, the French knights mounted their destriers and formed their battle line with all the pageantry their tradition demanded. Banners fluttered in the morning breeze, each one representing centuries of noble heritage and martial pride. The sight was magnificent, a living tapestry of medieval chivalry that would have stirred the heart of any chronicler. Count John of Nevers raised his lance, its steel point catching the sunlight like a star. Around him, 3,000 of France's finest knights lowered their own weapons, the forest of steel creating shadows across the ground. These men had been trained from childhood for this moment, their lives dedicated to the pursuit of honor and glory. Yet for all their courage and skill, they were about to face an enemy that fought by entirely different rules. The charge began with a sound like thunder rolling across the hills. Thousands of hooves pounded the earth as the flower of French chivalry surged forward, their war cries echoing off the walls of Nicopolis. It was a sight that had struck terror into enemies for generations, an avalanche of steel and flesh that seemed capable of sweeping away any resistance. The very ground trembled beneath their advance as they bore down on the Ottoman lines with all the fury of righteous wrath. But Sultan Bayezid was ready for them. As the Christian knights closed the distance, his front line of conscripted infantry began their feigned retreat, drawing the enemy forward into the killing ground he had prepared. The stakes that had been concealed among the grass suddenly bristled like the spines of some monstrous hedgehog, while Ottoman archers rose from their concealment to loose volley after volley into the charging mass. The first horses to reach the stakes screamed as the sharpened wood pierced their bellies, throwing their riders to the ground in a tangle of armor and limbs. Others managed to leap the obstacles, only to find themselves facing a wall of Janissary pikes that rose like a steel forest before them. The precision of the Ottoman defense was terrifying to behold, each element working in perfect coordination to channel the Christian charge into predetermined killing zones. Yet the French knights pressed on with the desperate valor of men who knew that retreat meant dishonor worse than death. Some managed to break through the first line of defense, their swords rising and falling as they carved paths through the Ottoman infantry. For a moment, it seemed as though their courage might triumph over the Sultan's strategy, that the weight of their charge could shatter even the most carefully prepared defense. Then came the sound that would haunt Christian dreams for generations to come. From the woods to the right, 5 cavalry burst 1,000 Serbian forth like wolves emerging from their lair. Stefan Lazarević led them with tears streaming down his face, his sword raised not in triumph, but in tragic necessity. These Orthodox Christians struck their co-religionists in the back with a ferocity born of desperation, and their charged shame timed perfectly to coincide with the moment when the French knights were most vulnerable. The impact was catastrophic. Caught between the disciplined resistance of the Janissaries to their front and the unexpected assault from their flank, the French line began to crumble. Knights who had ridden in perfect formation just moments before now found themselves isolated and surrounded, their horses stumbling over the bodies of fallen comrades. The very weight of their armor, which had seemed such an advantage, now became a burden as they struggled to rise from the blood-soaked ground. Count John of Nevers fought like a man possessed, his sword cutting crimson arcs through the morning air as Ottoman warriors pressed in from all sides. Around him, the survivors of the French charge had formed desperate circles of steel, their backs to one another, as they faced an enemy that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. The young noble who had dreamed of glory now found himself in a nightmare of blood and screaming horses, where the chivalric ideals of his youth crumbled like parchment in flames. From his command position, King Sigismund watched the destruction of the French vanguard with mounting horror. His experienced eye could read the battlefield like a book written in blood, and every page told the same story of tactical disaster. The cream of European chivalry was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that fought not for individual honor but for collective victory. Yet even as the French position collapsed, Hungarian pride demanded action. Against his better judgment, Sigismund ordered his own forces forward. Perhaps he could salvage something from this catastrophe. Perhaps the weight of Hungarian cavalry could break the Ottoman trap that had snared the French. His knights thundered across the field, their battle cry echoing off the fortress walls as they sought to rescue their beleaguered allies. For a moment, hope flickered in Christian hearts as fresh reinforcements joined the fray. But hope is a fragile thing on the battlefield, and Sultan Bayezid had not exhausted his reserves. As the Hungarian charge struck his lines, the Ottoman reserves surged forward like a black tide. The Sipahi cavalry, held back for this precise moment, swept around the flanks while fresh Janissary units moved to contain the assault. What had begun as a rescue became another massacre, as Christian knight after Christian knight fell beneath Ottoman steel. By afternoon, the field belonged to the crescent moon. The flower of European nobility lay trampled in Bulgarian soil, their banners torn and bloodied, their dreams of glory transformed into a nightmare of defeat. 3,000 French knights had charged that morning. Fewer than 200 would see another dawn. King Sigismund himself barely escaped, fleeing to a Venetian galley on the Danube as his kingdom's hopes died around him. The aftermath was as brutal as the battle itself. Sultan Bayezid, enraged by the slaughter of Ottoman prisoners earlier in the campaign, ordered the execution of captured nobles. Only the youngest was spared, destined for slavery in Ottoman lands. Count John of Nevers, who had dreamed of earning glory, found himself a prisoner whose ransom would bankrupt his family's treasury. The Battle of Nicopolis shattered more than armies. It destroyed the illusion that medieval chivalry could stand against disciplined professionalism. The age of crusading was over, killed not by lack of faith but by the cold reality of tactical evolution. The cross that had inspired so many had finally crumbled, and with it died the last great dream of Christian unity against the Ottoman tide. In the end, Nicopolis became a tomb for an entire way of warfare, a monument to the price of pride and the deadly cost of refusing to adapt. The fortress still stands today, a silent witness to the day when the medieval world died and the modern age began in blood.